This story is titled, At a Family Holiday, I Gave My Brother a Mystery Gift. Payment for his apartment rent. He said I'm just trying to prove I'm not a failure and humiliated me in front of everyone, so I took the box back, told him to keep living like a homeless person, cut him off, and Mom and Dad kept begging us to make up. Hey Reddit, my name is Marcus, and I'm 29 years old. This whole mess started when my mom called me in tears about my brother's crisis. She explained that he was behind on rent, but too proud to ask for help directly, and maybe as the big brother, I could step in and offer some assistance. So I did exactly that. I tried to help him out. His response to my generosity? Tries to compensate for being a loser in this family. Yeah, you read that right. So I took the money back immediately and watched his life fall apart quietly from the sidelines. That lasted until the day he showed up on my porch, completely broken out of options, finally ready to swallow his pride. Here's how everything went down, and I'll start with some background to put you guys in the picture so you understand the full context. I'm a 29-year-old male who grew up in a neighborhood just outside Cleveland. I was always the kid with grease permanently embedded under my fingernails, the one who could fix anything that broke around the house. Meanwhile, my younger brother Dylan, who's 27 now, was the one walking around with pristine report cards and academic awards decorating his bedroom walls. Our family home was a modest 3-bedroom house with peeling vinyl siding that our dad kept promising to replace next summer for about 8 years running. Spoiler alert, it never happened. The house wasn't much to look at, but it was ours, and we made it work. Dad worked at the Republic Steel Mill for 17 solid years until the layoffs hit hard in 2009 when the economy completely tanked. Before that economic disaster, he'd put in his time on the factory floor, coming home every single day with his work boots caked in metal shavings and sporting that 1,000-yard stare that guys develop after watching gauges and machinery for 13 hours straight. It's a look you can't fake. Pure exhaustion mixed with the kind of focus that comes from knowing one mistake could cost you a finger or worse. Mom did her best to supplement the family income by picking up whatever shifts she could manage at the local IHOP. Some weeks she'd work doubles that left her feet so swollen she could barely walk by the time she got home. I remember watching her soak her feet in Epsom salt baths while counting tips on the kitchen table, always hoping she'd made enough to cover whatever unexpected expense had popped up that week. We weren't poor exactly, but we definitely weren't comfortable either. Every car repair became a full-scale family crisis that required careful budget adjustments and heated discussions about what we could postpone to make room for the expense. Every school trip or activity required weeks of planning and penny pinching to make it happen. By the time I turned 18, I knew with absolute certainty that college wasn't going to be in the cards for me. And honestly, I was okay with that. While Dylan spent his senior year prepping for his SATs and researching college programs, I was already climbing rooftops as part of an apprenticeship program that would eventually lead to my career in HVAC. I'll never forget my first day on the job. The journeyman handed me a heavy toolbox and looked me dead in the eye. "Drop this, you're fired. Fall, you're dead," he said, with the kind of matter-of-fact delivery that told me he wasn't joking around. It was simple enough advice, and it pretty much summed up the reality of the work I was getting into. Dylan ended up getting accepted to Ohio State University with a partial scholarship, which was genuinely impressive and something the whole family was proud of. What followed was like a parade of relatives congratulating my parents on raising such a brilliant son. The Facebook posts started immediately, with pictures of Dylan in his Ohio State gear and captions about how proud everyone was. Dad even got one of those Ohio State Dad bumper stickers for our rusted-out Ford, and the neighbors couldn't stop asking when they were going to drive him up to campus for orientation. Meanwhile, my decision to become an HVAC technician was met with polite but strained smiles from extended family members and comments like, "At least it's honest work." The kind of backhanded compliment that's supposed to sound supportive, but really just highlights how they view manual labor as somehow lesser than academic achievement. My Aunt Carol actually had the nerve to pat my shoulder and say, "Not everyone's cut out for academics, honey," with this patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. The irony wasn't lost on me when she called me in a panic the following weekend because her furnace had broken down and she needed someone to fix it immediately. I nodded politely at her comment and then spent my Saturday afternoon crawling around her basement, diagnosing the problem and getting her heat working again while she sat upstairs in her warm kitchen. Those first few years in the trade were absolutely brutal, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. I was up every morning at 4:30 a.m. for safety meetings that started promptly at 5:30, followed by 9 to 13 hours of physical labor that left every muscle in my body screaming by the end of the day. Summers in Ohio can get absolutely brutal when you're working in the HVAC field. Picture crawling through cramped attics in 98-degree heat while wearing full safety gear. It's not exactly the kind of work environment they highlight in the career brochures. But somehow, the winters were even worse than the summers. There's nothing quite like the experience of working on rooftop units during a January blizzard, trying to repair heating systems while your fingers go completely numb despite wearing 2 pairs of gloves. You learn to work fast and efficiently because the longer you're exposed to those conditions, the more dangerous it becomes. Despite the physical demands and harsh working conditions, I was making real money, actual substantial income that allowed me to start building something for myself. During Dylan's first winter break from college, he came home wearing an Ohio State hoodie and talking about his sociology professor like they were old drinking buddies who'd known each other for years. Dad would hang on every single word Dylan said, nodding enthusiastically and asking detailed questions about campus life and his classes. When I actually managed to make it to family dinners during those early years, Dylan would completely dominate the conversation with stories about his roommate, whose father apparently owned some major tech company, and tales of campus parties and academic discussions. He'd casually drop the names of books that no one else at the table had ever read, then express genuine shock and mild contempt that we weren't familiar with them. "Marcus wouldn't know," he'd say with this smirk whenever the conversation turned to anything he considered intellectual or sophisticated. He's more of a hands-on guy. The way he emphasized hands-on made it sound like he was describing some kind of learning disability rather than a valuable skill set. My usual response was something like, "Someone's got to keep the heat on while you're discovering yourself," which inevitably made the entire table tense up like I'd just committed some major social faux pas. The atmosphere would become so uncomfortable that I started picking up extra shifts whenever Dylan was home for breaks. Not just for the additional money, but for the peace of mind that came from being away from my own kitchen table. Dylan sailed through college with a business degree and managed to land a corporate job in downtown Cleveland at a marketing consulting firm. Suddenly, he had transformed into the family's golden child who had officially made it in everyone's eyes. Family gatherings became his personal stage, where everyone would hang on his every word as he regaled us with stories about his downtown apartment, his networking events, and his stock options. He'd casually drop corporate terminology like acquisition pipeline and market penetration into normal conversations, making sure everyone knew he was operating on a different level than the rest of us. The way my mom would introduce us to her friends became particularly grating over time. "This is Dylan. He's in marketing," she'd say, with obvious pride and a straightforward tone that conveyed how impressed she was with his career choice. Then she'd turn to me and say, "And Marcus here does, what do they call it again, sweetheart?" Followed by, "Climate control maintenance." Like she couldn't quite remember the job title of work I'd been doing successfully for 6 years at that point. The truth is, HVAC work is incredibly solid and reliable. Sure, the hours can be absolutely brutal, especially during peak season when you're spending long days up on rooftops in the worst possible weather conditions. But the pay is genuinely good. Better than good, actually. By the time I reached 26, I was pulling in 6 figures with overtime, had my 3-bedroom ranch house in Westside nearly paid off completely, and was consistently setting aside $1,900 every single month for retirement. I wasn't carrying any debt, I avoided flashy spending, and I was just steadily building wealth through consistent, practical decisions. I managed to buy my house from a retiring couple for $32,000 under market value because I was able to offer $148,000 in cash with a quick closing timeline. For 3 years leading up to that purchase, I'd been living with my buddy Kevin in what I can only describe as a complete shithole apartment, banking almost every dollar I made while other guys my age were spending their money on expensive cars and weekend trips. My parents thought I was absolutely crazy for living so frugally until they actually saw the deed to my house with my name on it. I fixed all the plumbing myself, spent a couple of weekends rewiring the outdated electrical panels, and installed new energy-efficient windows that cut my heating bill in half during the first winter. The neighbors would nod approvingly whenever they saw me patching the roof or pressure washing the siding, the kind of slow, steady improvement that you can actually see and appreciate over time. Meanwhile, Dylan was living in a downtown loft with exposed brick walls and industrial fixtures that was costing him nearly $3,200 every month in rent alone. He leased a BMW 3 Series that spent most of its time sitting in a parking garage because downtown Cleveland isn't exactly designed for joyrides. Every time we talked, he had some new story about a bar where individual drinks cost $15, or a weekend trip to Chicago where he'd crashed at a buddy's place and networked with some serious players in whatever industry was trending that month. But for all his constant talk about financial acumen and business strategy, Dylan never seemed to actually be building anything substantial or lasting. He was just spending money and talking about spending money, creating this elaborate lifestyle that looked impressive from the outside but had no real foundation underneath it. Around this time, he started dating a girl named Jessica, tall, blonde, and always wearing those designer sunglasses even when it was cloudy outside. She'd show up to family dinners wearing clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. The breaking point came at my cousin Tim's 31st birthday party, which was held at a brewery downtown. I had driven straight from a 13-hour shift and still had dirt under my fingernails despite scrubbing them thoroughly in the brewery bathroom before joining everyone. Dylan and Jessica showed up more than an hour late, making a dramatic entrance like they were celebrities arriving at a premiere. Dylan immediately made a big show of ordering appetizers for the entire table, then launched into this elaborate story about his recent business trip to Denver. "You should have seen this hotel," he was saying loud enough for everyone to hear. 44th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. The client practically begged me to extend the trip for another few days. Then he turned to me with this condescending smile. "Mark, you'd never believe what some of these executive suites cost per night. Probably what you make in a week, right?" I looked at him for a moment before responding. "Wouldn't know," I said calmly. "I spend my money on things I actually own." The entire table gave a collective ooh, like we were back in high school and someone had just delivered a particularly brutal comeback. Dylan's face twitched slightly, but then he forced out this fake laugh that fooled absolutely no one. "That's Marcus for you," he announced to the table with exaggerated amusement. Always so practical. That's what happens when you peak in high school shop class. My cousin Tim's wife Susan, who had never particularly cared for Dylan's antics, cut in sharply before I could respond. "Didn't Marcus just finish paying off his house at 26? Dylan waved a dismissive hand like he was brushing away an annoying fly. "Real estate in the suburbs barely counts," he said with obvious disdain. "It'll never appreciate the way my downtown loft will." The conversation eventually moved on to other topics, but I couldn't forget the look on Dylan's face when Susan mentioned my house, like he'd just bitten into something unexpectedly sour. That night, when I got home, I added another $1,000 to my investment account just out of pure spite. My parents weren't nearly as fortunate as I was after the recession hit our area hard. Dad's back finally gave out completely after years of chronic pain and physical deterioration from his factory work. He ended up with 2 herniated discs that the company doctor conveniently labeled as age-appropriate degeneration to avoid having to pay any disability benefits. Mom's arthritis eventually ended her waitressing career when she dropped a full tray of food during a busy shift and got written up for it, which was essentially the final straw for her employment there. Bills started piling up rapidly, and their mortgage went underwater when property values crashed in our neighborhood. When they were facing foreclosure, my cousin who worked at the local bank tipped me off about their situation before it became a complete disaster. I stepped in and paid their back payments, helped them sell the house before they lost it completely, and found them a decent 2-bedroom apartment in a senior community that was much more manageable for their situation. I handled the entire move myself with a rented U-Haul truck and 2 buddies from work who volunteered their weekend to help out. After they got settled into their new place, I started covering their rent, then their utilities, then their groceries. It wasn't some big announcement or dramatic gesture. I just quietly set up the automatic payments and made sure they had what they needed to live comfortably. They were grateful at first, maybe even a little embarrassed by needing the help, but that awkwardness faded pretty quickly. Soon it just became expected rather than appreciated. Dad would call me with observations like, "The cable bill seems particularly high this month," or "We're thinking about getting one of those meal delivery services we saw advertised on TV." There was always this underlying assumption that I would handle whatever financial issue they were presenting, no matter how unnecessary or frivolous it might seem. The whole arrangement was costing me about $2,200 every month all in. Not devastating to my salary by any means, but definitely not nothing either. That summer, I had been planning a fishing trip to northern Michigan with some guys from work for months. I had it marked on my calendar, paid the non-refundable deposit for the cabin, bought new fishing gear, and was genuinely looking forward to getting away for a few days. 3 days before we were scheduled to leave, my mom called with that familiar tension in her voice that immediately told me this conversation was going to be about money. "Your father's prescription plan changed," she started, and I could already feel my weekend plans evaporating. "The new copays are absolutely ridiculous, Marcus. It's going to be almost $420 this month just for his medications." I looked over at my packed duffel bag sitting by the front door, thought about the non-refundable cabin deposit I'd already paid, and the cooler I'd already filled with drinks and food for the trip. "I'll transfer the money tomorrow morning," I said, already mentally calculating what this unexpected expense would do to my carefully planned monthly budget. I had to call Kevin and let him know I couldn't make the fishing trip after all. I made up some vague excuse about work scheduling conflicts that he probably didn't believe, but he was polite enough not to push for details. Instead of spending those vacation days relaxing by a lake in northern Michigan, I used them to refinish my deck, spending the entire time wondering what Dylan was doing with his paid time off. He was probably somewhere with an infinity pool and tropical drinks that come with those tiny paper umbrellas. Throughout all of this, Dylan was fully aware that I was financially supporting our parents, but he never once offered to pitch in or contribute to their expenses. He was always between bonuses or reallocating his investment portfolio or dealing with some other elaborate financial situation that conveniently meant he wasn't opening his wallet. But he never missed an opportunity to mention his latest promotion at work or describe the fancy client dinner he'd attended the night before. "Must be nice having such a simple job," he'd say sometimes during family conversations. "No real stress, just physical work." This commentary was coming from a guy whose biggest daily workplace hazard was probably getting a paper cut while shuffling through marketing reports. "Someone's got to keep the systems running while you're out there networking," I'd reply, and the entire table would go uncomfortably quiet like I'd just dropped a conversational bomb in the middle of dinner. It was around this time, about 3 years ago, that I started dating Victoria. She's 26, practical as hell, and absolutely refuses to take shit from anyone. She has a master's degree in physical therapy and specializes in industrial injury rehabilitation, which means she works with guys like my dad, trying to help them regain functionality after years of physical labor have destroyed their bodies. She drives a 9-year-old Honda that she maintains meticulously, lives well within her means, and has a reputation for delivering rude awakenings to patients who think they can half-ass their recovery exercises and still get better. Our third date was accidentally at a hardware store, which sounds weird, but actually makes perfect sense when I explain it. We had originally planned to go out for dinner, but she mentioned wanting to replace some cabinet hardware in her kitchen, and we somehow ended up spending 2 hours debating the relative merits of different drawer slide mechanisms. We followed that up with takeout Chinese food eaten on her living room floor while sorting through bags of screws and hinges. Somehow, it ended up being the best date I'd had in years. My parents took to Victoria immediately, probably because she actually engages in real conversations with them instead of constantly checking her phone every 5 minutes like Dylan's rotating cast of girlfriends always did. She'd ask Dad detailed questions about his physical therapy progress and show him more effective ways to do his exercises. With Mom, she'd swap recipes and gardening tips for the little container garden they'd started on their apartment patio. By this point, Dylan had stopped talking about work specifics entirely, limiting himself to vague mentions of consulting stuff and references to a new client he couldn't name, due to confidentiality agreements. When he met Victoria at a family dinner, he did that thing where he slightly raised his eyebrows, like he was genuinely surprised that I could manage to land someone like her. The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. "So, physical therapy," he said to Victoria, with that tone he used when he wanted to sound interested, but was really just setting up for a backhanded comment. "That must be really rewarding work." The way he emphasized rewarding made it crystal clear that he meant not financially lucrative. His usual way of dismissing any career that didn't revolve around profit margins and corporate climbing. Victoria just smiled politely and responded, "I get to help people regain their independence after injuries that would have permanently disabled them 20 years ago. And the pay is actually quite solid. Not everyone measures success by their zip code, you know." Dylan changed the subject pretty quickly after that response. Things between Victoria and me got serious pretty fast. 7 months into our relationship, we had keys to each other's places and had developed a comfortable Sunday morning routine that we both looked forward to. It was around this time that Victoria started noticing the established pattern with my parents, how they'd call with emergencies that always seemed to require exactly the amount of money they happened to be short that particular month. She also noticed how I never said no to these requests, even when it meant canceling our plans or completely rearranging my own budget to accommodate their needs. "You realize you've been postponing that root canal for 9 months now," she said one evening after I winced while eating ice cream. We were sitting on my deck, enjoying the warm summer air even after sunset, all while sending your parents money for their cable package upgrade. I shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "It's not that bad. The ibuprofen mostly works for the pain. Until it doesn't, and you end up needing a full extraction that costs twice as much as the root canal would have," she replied matter-of-factly. "Your parents have Medicare, they have Social Security, they have options. Your tooth isn't optional, Marcus." "They're my parents," I said, as if that simple fact explained and justified everything. "And you're my partner," she replied without missing a beat. "Which means I get to call you on your shit when you're literally setting yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm." 4 days later, I finally went in for the root canal procedure. Victoria drove me to the appointment and back home afterward, stopped to pick up my prescription without me even asking, and managed to avoid saying "I told you so" even once during my recovery. That night, while I was still a bit fuzzy from the pain medication, she sat down on the edge of my bed and had a conversation that I couldn't ignore or deflect. "I need to know something important," she said, looking directly at me with complete seriousness. "Are we actually building a future together? Or am I just watching you bankroll your family's lifestyle while you put your own life on permanent hold?" The question hit me harder than I expected. "I want a future with you," I said, the words slightly slurred from the medication but completely sincere. "Then we need to have a serious talk about boundaries, because right now you don't have any," she continued. "And I'm not signing up for a lifetime of being second priority to your parents' cable bill or Dylan's next rent crisis." She squeezed my hand gently. "I love that you're reliable, Marcus. I really do. But there's a significant difference between being dependable and being treated like a personal ATM." She was absolutely right, and I knew she was right. But knowing something and actually doing something about it are two entirely different things. Last December, things shifted dramatically when my parents asked me to come over for coffee on a Sunday afternoon. They both seemed unusually nervous, which definitely wasn't like them at all. "Dylan's having some serious financial trouble," Mom said, stirring her coffee endlessly without actually drinking any of it. "He wouldn't want us telling you this, but he's fallen behind on his rent payments." I sat there processing this information slowly. Dylan, Mr. Corporate Success himself, couldn't make his rent. "What exactly happened?" I asked, genuinely curious about how his supposed financial expertise had led to this situation. Dad finally looked up from his hands. "The company did some restructuring a while back. He got moved to a different department with significantly less commission potential. He's too proud to admit that he's struggling financially," Mom added quickly, like she was afraid I might judge him harshly. "He'd absolutely kill us if he knew we were here asking you for help. But Christmas is coming up, and we thought maybe you could help him out, just for a few months until he gets back on his feet properly." I didn't answer immediately. Part of me wanted to laugh out loud at the irony. After years and years of Dylan's subtle but constant jabs about my blue-collar limitations and lack of sophistication, the thought of him desperately needing my financial help was darkly satisfying in a way I'm not entirely proud of. "I'll think about it," I said finally, not wanting to commit to anything in the moment. And I really did think about it seriously. Victoria's opinion was that I should help, but not necessarily for Dylan's sake. She thought I should do it for my parents, who were clearly stressed and worried about the situation. So I made the decision to cover 3 months of his rent as a Christmas gift. No strings attached, no lecture about financial responsibility, just cash to help him bridge whatever gap he was dealing with. When I told Victoria about my plan, her response was carefully measured. "That's genuinely generous of you," she said. "Just make sure he understands that this is help, not some kind of handout he's entitled to. And for God's sake, make him sign something official." I laughed at the suggestion. "It's a Christmas gift, not a bank loan." She didn't laugh back. "You're giving your brother, who has never appreciated a single thing you've done for anyone, enough cash to buy a decent used car. At minimum, he should acknowledge it properly and treat it with the respect it deserves." I showed up at my parents' place for Christmas Eve with Victoria beside me, and the envelope tucked securely inside my jacket pocket. Dylan arrived more than an hour late with some elaborate excuse about traffic that nobody really believed. That's when I noticed that his girlfriend Jessica wasn't with him, which was unusual since they'd been practically joined at the designer-labeled hip for almost 2 years at that point. "Where's Jessica?" Mom asked as she handed Dylan his usual drink. We're taking some time apart, he said curtly, then immediately changed the subject like he didn't want to discuss it further. Throughout dinner, Dylan was noticeably subdued compared to his usual self. He was missing his typical enthusiastic talk about market trends and exotic business trips. Instead, he actually asked Dad genuine questions about his physical therapy progress and seemed to listen to the answers with real interest. He complimented Mom's turkey, even though we all knew it was dry as sawdust as usual. He even asked Victoria several questions about her work without his typical condescending undertone. Dylan had been laying it on thick all evening, almost like he somehow knew he needed to earn his seat at the table for once. But old habits die hard, and his true nature couldn't stay hidden forever. After we finished dinner, we moved on to the traditional gift exchange. I handed Dylan the sealed envelope containing $2,500 in cash, enough to cover 3 months of rent based on what my parents had told me about his situation. There was no card, no note, no conditions attached, just money to help him get back on his feet. What he did next still makes my blood boil when I think about it. He tore the envelope open in this lazy, casual way, like he was opening junk mail. He thumbed through the bills with raised eyebrows, taking his time to count them. Then he looked around the room at everyone watching him and announced with a smirk, "Tries to compensate for being a loser in this family." And they actually laughed. Dad snorted into his eggnog like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. Mom covered her mouth with her hand, but she couldn't hide the smile spreading across her face. Victoria froze beside me, and I could feel her expression shifting from shock to pure anger in real time. The room fell completely silent as I stared at Dylan, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement that he'd just crossed a line. But no one was laughing anymore. They were all just sitting there, looking uncomfortable, like they suddenly realized what had actually just happened. I reached over and snatched the envelope directly from his hands. "You know what, Dylan? You can rot in your own mess that you're trying so hard to hide from everyone," I said, keeping my voice steady and controlled. "Everyone in this room knows you're completely broke. Your credit cards are maxed out, you're about to be evicted from your overpriced apartment, but sure, go ahead and laugh at the guy who actually has his shit together." His face went pale instantly. I stood up, helped Victoria with her coat, and walked toward the door without looking back at any of them. The last thing I heard as we left was Mom calling out, "Marcus, don't be so sensitive!" We were halfway to my car when Victoria suddenly turned around and marched back toward the apartment. I followed her, not entirely sure what she was planning, but knowing it was going to be memorable. She threw open the door without bothering to knock and walked straight back to the living room where my family was still sitting in awkward silence. "You," she said, pointing directly at Dylan, "are a pathetic excuse for a brother. You're about to be evicted from your overpriced apartment, and Marcus, who has been financially supporting your parents while you've been playing businessman, was going to bail you out with no strings attached." Then she turned to face my parents. "And you two are so completely blinded by your golden child that you actually laughed when he insulted the son who keeps your lights on every month." The drive home was silent for the first 10 minutes, and then Victoria started laughing. Not angry laughter, but genuine amusement. "I cannot believe I just did that," she said, shaking her head. "That's not me at all. I'm usually so professional and controlled." Despite everything that had just happened, I found myself smiling. "That was honestly the hottest thing I've ever seen," I told her. "Yeah?" Her laughter faded to a small smile. "Well, just promise me you won't let them walk all over you again. I don't want to fight your battles for you, Marcus. I want to build something with you, but I need to know you've got my back too." "I promise," I said, and I meant it. The phone call started the very next morning. He didn't mean it. It was just a joke. "You know how Dylan gets when he's nervous," Mom said in the first voicemail. I let them all go to voicemail without listening to most of them. January brought a massive ice storm that kept me working 17-hour shifts for nearly a week straight. When I finally checked my phone at 3 a.m. after restoring heat to a nursing home, I had 7 missed calls from Mom. I ignored them all and went home to sleep. 3 days later, Victoria handed me her phone during dinner with a strange expression on her face. There was a Facebook message from Dylan that had been sent at 1:52 a.m. "Hey, Victoria, I feel terrible about what happened at Christmas. Marcus isn't answering my calls. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime. You seem like someone who gets it." Then, sent an hour later, "You seem like someone who belongs in the city, not stuck with a guy who fixes air conditioners for a living. Maybe in another universe, right? Are you fucking kidding me?" Victoria said, as she deleted the messages and immediately blocked him. Your brother is not only pathetic, but apparently hits on his brother's girlfriend at 2 in the morning. I seriously considered driving over to wherever Dylan was staying and putting him through a wall. But that's exactly what he wanted. Proof that I was just some blue-collar hothead who couldn't control his temper. I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Besides, guys like Dylan have a tendency to self-destruct without any help from anyone else. 2 weeks after Christmas, my parents showed up at my door completely unannounced. They stood awkwardly on my front porch, looking uncomfortable and nervous about whatever conversation they were planning to have. Dylan is behind on rent, Mom said as soon as I let them inside. He's going to be evicted if he doesn't pay by Friday. He regrets what happened at Christmas, Dad added quickly, like he was trying to head off any objections I might have. He feels terrible about it. I leaned against my kitchen counter and looked at both of them. If he feels so terrible about it, why isn't he here telling me himself? Mom glanced at Dad before answering. He's too ashamed to face you, but I knew better than that. It wasn't shame keeping Dylan away from my door. It was his pride. His ego simply couldn't handle the idea of asking for help, especially from his blue-collar brother, who wasn't supposed to be more successful than him, according to his worldview. Look, I said, keeping my voice even and controlled. I've been paying your rent and bills for 4 years now. Never complained about it, never held it over your heads, never made you feel bad about needing the help. But I'm drawing a hard line here. I paused to make sure they were really listening. If you want to help Dylan, then help him yourselves. You need to make a choice. Either you accept my help and stop defending Dylan when he treats me like shit, or we're completely done with this arrangement. I'm not an ATM that you can just keep hitting up whenever someone in the family has a financial crisis. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a long moment. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from her purse, and Dad stared down at his hands like he was studying them for the first time. We never meant to take you for granted, Dad finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. We do appreciate everything you do for us. Mom nodded emphatically. We'll talk to Dylan and make him understand how wrong he was. They chose the first option, continuing to accept my support while promising to treat me with basic respect. I wasn't entirely convinced they'd actually follow through on their promise to confront Dylan, but it was at least something resembling progress. Life went on after that confrontation. I picked up a major storm recovery contract in February that had me working 17-hour days, repairing HVAC systems across 3 different counties after a series of severe weather events knocked out power and heating for thousands of people. The work was exhausting but lucrative, and it kept me busy enough that I didn't have much time to dwell on family drama. Through the family grapevine, mainly my cousin Steve, who never could keep his mouth shut about anything, I heard that Dylan was taking loans from various relatives scattered across our extended family. He'd borrowed $550 from Uncle Bill and a full $1,000 from Cousin Tim, who had just gotten a severance package from his job. Dylan always presented these requests with elaborate promises about repayment schedules and interest rates, and he always had some story about how this was just a temporary cash flow issue that would be resolved as soon as his next bonus came through. That same cousin also let slip that Jessica had actually dumped Dylan before Christmas, when his credit card got declined during dinner at some fancy restaurant downtown. Apparently, she had called it the last straw, after months of dealing with bounced checks and increasingly creative excuses for why he couldn't pay for things. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for Dylan, even through all my anger and frustration with him. Getting publicly dumped by someone you thought was in your corner has to sting badly, no matter how much of a jerk you might be. That sympathy completely evaporated about a week later when Mom called me in tears. She mentioned earlier in the week that she couldn't find her favorite earrings, but I didn't think much of it at the time since people misplace jewelry all the time. But then she dropped the real news on me. Dad's watch was missing, along with her pearl earrings and several other small valuables that had been sitting around their apartment. She had confronted Dylan directly about the missing items, and he had denied everything with such complete conviction and apparent outrage that she had almost believed his denials. That is, until she found the pawnshop receipt tucked into the pocket of his jeans while she was doing his laundry. I don't know what to do, Marcus, she sobbed over the phone. He's my son, but he actually stole from us. He stole from his own parents. For the first time in years, she seemed to really see Dylan for what he had become rather than what she wanted him to be. File a police report, I said simply. I can't do that to him, she gasped, like I'd suggested something unthinkable. Then he'll keep doing it, I replied matter-of-factly. And next time it might be your wedding ring or something even more important. She didn't end up filing a police report, but she did ask Dylan to move out of their apartment, which showed more backbone than I had expected from her. Dylan ended up couch surfing with increasingly distant acquaintances before eventually landing at our cousin Ryan's place, apparently with nowhere else to turn. By March, Dylan's entire financial house of cards was obviously collapsing. He had maxed out multiple credit cards, borrowed money from everyone who would still answer his phone calls, and was apparently sleeping in his office some nights to save money on gas for commuting. But somehow, he was still showing up to family dinners, wearing expensive designer shirts and talking confidently about the vacation he was supposedly planning for the summer. Meanwhile, Victoria and I were absolutely thriving. I got promoted to crew supervisor, which meant significantly better hours and a substantial pay increase. I was now managing a team of 9 technicians, coordinating directly with local government officials during power outages and handling emergency response protocols for the entire region. The promotion came with a company truck that I could take home, and I earned a municipal emergency response certification that added another $4.25 per hour to my base pay rate. In April, I decided to propose to Victoria. I didn't want anything overly fancy or dramatic, just the two of us on a weekend hiking trip in the beautiful Cuyahoga Valley. I had been carrying the engagement ring around with me for 4 weeks, waiting for what felt like the perfect moment to present itself. When it finally happened, she said yes before I could even finish asking the question properly. We set our wedding date for October, just 6 months after the proposal, and sent out invitations to all our family members, including Dylan. We wanted to keep things relatively small and intimate, rather than having some massive, expensive celebration that would put us in debt. Dylan didn't show up to our wedding. No phone call, no text message, absolutely nothing. The wedding itself was small and perfect. Just 55 people gathered at a renovated barn outside the city that created exactly the atmosphere we wanted. The entire event cost us $16,500 all in, which Victoria and I split right down the middle because we both rejected the traditional expectation that the bride's family should pay for everything. My parents came early to help with the setup and decorations. When Victoria's sister asked where my brother was during the reception, my mom immediately jumped in with a series of elaborate excuses. He had an important work event that he couldn't get out of, she said. He sent his regrets and said he was so disappointed to miss such a special day. I just nodded politely and changed the subject because I wasn't going to let Dylan's absence cast any kind of shadow over what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. What my mother didn't know at the time was that I had run into Dylan's roommate Ryan at the hardware store about a week before the wedding. According to Ryan, Dylan had initially moved from crashing on his couch to formally renting a room in his apartment. But then he had mysteriously disappeared one Tuesday while Ryan was at work, owing 2 months' rent and taking Ryan's Xbox and golf clubs with him. No forwarding address, no explanation, just completely gone without a trace. Ryan told me he was seriously considering taking legal action against Dylan. He said he had kept all the receipts and text message conversations just in case he needed them for court. He asked if I knew where Dylan was currently staying, and I told him honestly that I had no idea. My brother had essentially gone ghost, not just on me, but apparently on everyone except our parents. 4 months into married life, everything was going incredibly well for Victoria and me. We were seriously talking about starting a house fund so we could buy something a bit bigger, maybe with some land where I could set up a proper workshop. I had been obsessed with the idea of restoring a 1969 Camaro ever since I saw one at a car show with my uncle when I was 13 years old. It was midnight blue with chrome trim that looked like expensive jewelry, and I had promised myself that someday I would get one of my own. Then my mother called on a Tuesday night in February, and I could immediately tell from her voice that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Dylan's in serious trouble," she said, her voice tight with stress. "His friend Ryan is actually suing him for unpaid loans and all that stuff he stole. It's going to court next month if he doesn't come up with the money to settle." I didn't respond immediately because part of me wanted to say that this was Dylan's problem to solve on his own. He had made his choices and created this mess through his own actions. "He's in really bad shape, Marcus," she continued when I didn't speak. "I've never seen him like this before. He's been staying with us for the past month." That was completely news to me. I had stopped by their apartment just 3 weeks earlier to fix their garbage disposal, and there had been absolutely no sign that Dylan was living there. "He leaves before you usually come by and comes back late at night," she admitted when I asked about it. "He didn't want you to know he was there." "Where exactly is he sleeping?" I asked. "That place is barely big enough for you two, Mom." She hesitated before answering. "On the sofa. He stays out most days looking for work. Looking for work, I thought to myself. More likely he was hiding from debt collectors or trying to pawn whatever else he could get his hands on. Why are you telling me this? I asked, though I already knew exactly what the answer was going to be. He needs help, Marcus. Real help this time. Victoria and I talked it over that night after I explained the situation to her. She was understandably hesitant about the whole thing. He's never apologized to you, she pointed out, which was absolutely true. Not once in all this time, not even after what happened at Christmas. She was completely right about that. But family is complicated, I said, not entirely sure why I was even considering helping him. If, and that's a very big if, you decide to help him, it needs to be completely on your terms, she said firmly. No more of this unconditional bailout nonsense. 3 days later, there was a knock at my front door around 9:30 in the evening. When I opened it, Dylan was standing on my porch looking like absolute hell. I almost didn't recognize him. He had lost weight, his clothes looked like he'd been sleeping in them, and he had this defeated expression that I'd never seen on his face before. I let him inside, and we sat at my kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee between us that neither of us actually touched. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever, uncomfortable and thick with years of unresolved tension. So, I finally said, Mom tells me you're being sued. He nodded, his eyes focused on the table. Ryan loaned me $16,000 last year. I kept telling him I'd pay him back after my next bonus, but there was no bonus, I finished for him. There hasn't been a bonus in almost 2 years, he admitted quietly. The department restructuring was actually a demotion. I've been barely making base salary since then. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. And all those networking events, the client dinners, the stock options you were always talking about? He gave a hollow, bitter laugh. I was grabbing free appetizers at real estate open houses and corporate recruitment events. I was sleeping on Ryan's couch 3 nights a week to save money on utilities. The stock options were real, but they're completely underwater now and worth nothing. Silence came back even heavier this time, settling between us like a weight. I waited, letting him sit with the discomfort. This was his show to run, and he needed to be the one to drive this conversation forward. I haven't been fair to you, he finally said, the words coming out slowly and awkwardly. You could say that, I replied, not making this any easier for him. He started fiddling nervously with the handle of his untouched coffee mug. I always thought I'd be, I don't know, more than I am right now. You always thought you were too good to be a decent brother, I said bluntly. His head snapped up at that. I didn't say that. You didn't have to say it. You've been showing it for years through your actions and attitude. He looked away again, clearly uncomfortable with having his behavior called out so directly. I screwed up, okay? Is that what you want to hear? I made terrible choices. I've been living on credit cards and complete bullshit for 2 years because I was too proud to admit that I got demoted. Too proud to downsize my apartment or sell my car and live within my actual means. It wasn't exactly a great apology, but it was honest. And honesty from Dylan was rarer than finding a decent pension plan these days. And now, you need me to bail you out, I said. It wasn't really a question. Look, I need help, Mark, he said finally, using the shortened version of my name that he hadn't used in years. I'm drowning here. Ryan's lawsuit is just the beginning. There are other people who could come after me next, and I'm already behind on rent again, even at Mom and Dad's place. I studied my brother's face carefully, really looking at him maybe for the first time in years. Behind the designer stubble and the practiced confidence that he usually wore like armor, he looked genuinely scared and exhausted. Very exhausted. I drummed my fingers on the table, letting him sit with the silence and uncertainty for a while longer. You've spent years mocking my job, I finally said, my voice calm but firm. Acting like I wasn't good enough to be in the same room as you. You mocked me at Christmas when I tried to help you. You hit on my wife with those pathetic late-night messages. He flinched visibly at each point I made. And now you're sitting here asking me to clean up the mess you created. I know I don't deserve it, he said quietly. But I don't have anywhere else to go. No one else who can help me. I let out a long, slow breath, considering my options. All right, listen carefully. I'll help with the lawsuit amount, but this isn't going to be a gift like last time. This is a loan with actual legal terms and conditions. The relief on his face was immediate and obvious. Anything. Whatever you need me to do, brother. You'll sign a proper legal promissory note, I continued. You'll pay me back on a schedule that we both agree on. And you'll get financial counseling from a professional. I know a guy who specializes in debt management and helping people get their finances back on track. And one more thing, I added before he could respond. No more bullshit. No more pretending to be something you're not. If you're struggling financially, you say so. To me, to mom and dad, to everyone. The act stops completely right now. He nodded eagerly. Okay, yes, I can do that. And you need to find your own place to live, I continued. Mom and dad's apartment is way too small, and you're stressing them out by being there. Where am I supposed to go? I can't afford rent anywhere decent, he protested. Nothing is decent enough for you, and that's exactly the problem right there, I replied, standing up from the table. Figure it out. Get a roommate, move to a cheaper neighborhood, do what normal people do when they can't afford something. They adjust their expectations and lifestyle. He looked like he wanted to argue with me, but he thought better of it. Fine, I'll figure something out. The next day, I transferred the money to cover Ryan's lawsuit and had my lawyer draw up proper paperwork. This wasn't going to be some casual handshake agreement. This was a legally binding document with specific payment terms, interest rates, and clear consequences for default. Dylan signed everything without hesitation, though I honestly don't know if he'll actually keep his word about repayment. His history strongly suggests otherwise, but that's almost secondary at this point. It's been 7 months since that conversation, and I have to say that Dylan has surprised me. He found a new job working at an insurance company, something entry-level that's a far cry from his marketing glory days, but it's stable and legitimate. He's been making his loan payments regularly. They're small payments, but they're consistent, which is more than I expected from him. He moved into a shared apartment with 2 guys from his new job. It's nothing fancy or impressive, but he's making it work without complaining about the downgrade. He even comes over for dinner sometimes now. It's still awkward between us, but he's clearly trying to rebuild some kind of relationship. Last week, he actually helped me install a new water heater without being asked. He didn't know the difference between a pipe wrench and a crescent wrench when we started, but he handed me tools and learned the differences quickly enough. It was not terrible, actually. We're never going to be best friends. There's way too much water under that bridge for that to happen. But we're slowly figuring out how to be brothers again, which is something I didn't think was possible a year ago. Victoria and I closed on 6 acres outside the city limits last month. The house needs plenty of work. The kitchen is outdated, there's carpeting that should have been replaced a decade ago, and the roof will need attention within the next year. But the structure is solid with good bones, as they say in real estate. Most importantly, it has a detached 3-car garage that's absolutely perfect for the workshop I've always wanted. I spent last weekend running new electrical lines to the garage and setting up proper workbenches along the walls. The 1969 Camaro that I'd been dreaming about for years finally arrived on a flatbed truck 3 weeks ago. It's honestly more rust than actual car at this point. The previous owner let it sit in a field for 16 years before deciding to sell it to me. The 350 engine is seized completely solid and will need either a complete rebuild or total replacement. The interior has become home to what seems like several generations of mice families. There's even a small sapling growing up through the passenger side floorboard, which gives you an idea of just how long this car has been sitting abandoned. The rust has eaten through about half the floor pans, and the quarter panels look like Swiss cheese. In other words, it's the perfect project car for what I have in mind. Victoria took one look at it when it arrived and started laughing. "This thing is going to keep you busy until retirement," she said, shaking her head in amusement. "That's exactly the point," I replied. "I've spent most of my adult life fixing other people's problems. Emergency heating repairs, family financial crises, relationship drama, you name it. This car represents something completely different for me. It's my project, undertaken entirely on my own terms. There's no deadline pressure, no emergency situation that needs immediate attention. Just the slow, methodical, deeply satisfying process of bringing something back to life, working at my own pace and on my own schedule." Dylan has started coming by sometimes to help with the car restoration. He's absolutely useless with tools. I'm talking about a guy who couldn't identify a socket wrench if his life depended on it. But he's turned out to be surprisingly good at finding obscure parts online. He has this weird talent for tracking down hard-to-find components on various specialty websites and auction sites. For his birthday last month, I handed him a completely greasy carburetor that needed rebuilding. The look on his face was absolutely priceless, like I'd just presented him with a dead rat wrapped in a bow. But you know what? The next weekend, he showed up at my door with the rebuilt part and this smugly satisfied expression on his face. YouTube tutorials, he explained when I raised an eyebrow in surprise. Turns out there are step-by-step videos for literally everything. As for my parents, they've adjusted to the new dynamic as well. They still call when they need help with something, but now they actually ask politely instead of just assuming I'll handle whatever problem they're presenting. It's a small change, but it makes a huge difference in how these conversations feel. Dad has started taking a woodworking class at the senior center, where he's learning to make picture frames and small decorative shelves. He insists on giving us his creations, even though they're usually slightly crooked and clearly made by someone still learning the craft. But there's something genuinely touching about the effort he's putting into this new hobby. Mom has been sending us home with containers of her homemade chili, which Victoria actually enjoys rather than just politely tolerating. It's become this nice little tradition where we'll stop by their place for a visit and leave with enough food for several meals. Last month, they called to tell me they were voluntarily cutting back on their cable package to save money. No drama, no hints about me covering the difference, no guilt trips about their reduced entertainment options. They were just matter-of-factly letting me know they were making adjustments to their budget like rational, responsible adults. These might seem like small steps to an outsider, but for our family, this represents major progress. Sometimes I find myself wondering what would have happened if I'd just kept saying yes to everything. If I'd never drawn that hard line at Christmas, never made Dylan sign that loan agreement, never stood up for myself, and demanded basic respect. Where would I be right now? Probably still signing over chunks of my paycheck without question. Still postponing my own life indefinitely to subsidize everyone else's poor financial decisions. Most likely, I'd be trapped in that cycle forever. But that's not how things played out, fortunately. And while it took me way too many years to learn this fundamental lesson, at least I finally did learn it. Being reliable and dependable doesn't mean allowing yourself to be used by people who should know better. Helping others doesn't mean completely neglecting your own needs and goals. And sometimes, the most generous thing you can do for the people you love is to stop enabling their worst habits and force them to take responsibility for their own lives. Last Sunday, Dylan came over unannounced with a cardboard box full of parts he'd managed to find for the Camaro restoration. We spent about 4 hours working together in comfortable silence, focused on cleaning and organizing the engine block components. The atmosphere was relaxed and productive in a way that our interactions hadn't been for years. As he was getting ready to leave, he handed me an envelope containing his latest loan payment, and it was 3 weeks early. "I got a small bonus at work," he said, without any of his old swagger or need to impress. "Figured I should put it toward what actually matters." Maybe he's finally starting to get it. Maybe we both are. Looking back on everything that's happened, I realized that setting boundaries wasn't about being cruel or punishing people I care about. It was about creating space for healthier relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. My parents treat me like an adult now instead of an ATM. Dylan is slowly learning what it means to be a responsible brother. Victoria and I are building something solid together without the constant drain of family financial drama. And me? I'm finally working on something that's entirely mine. A 1969 Camaro that's going to take years to restore properly, sitting in a workshop on property that Victoria and I own together. It's not glamorous work, and it's certainly not going to impress anyone on social media. But it's mine, and that makes all the difference in the world. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop fixing everyone else's problems and start building something worthwhile for yourself. It took me almost 30 years to figure that out, but I'm glad I finally did.